The 38th parallel played a vital role in the start of the Korean War. The 38th parallel was the border between the two states of Korea. The Soviet Union had occupied the area to the north of the 38th parallel, and the United States controlled the south. This caused disturbance, which eventually led to the Korean War. The war was devastating, not only for the two governments, but for the people who were residents of Korea. Around 2.5 million people lost their lives in the duration of the war, and in 1953, when the war ended, Korea was still separated, and each one still disliked each other.
On June 25, 1950, the Northern and Southern Koreans went to war after around 75,000 North Koreans rushed across the border between the two distinct governments. The military invasion was the first action of the Korean War, and no one really knew what the invasion had coming in the future. This attack was the result of disputes between the two governments and of larger powers on whether communism or democracy was right for their large regimes. It was as if the United States and Russia were puppeting smaller countries for their own gain. With the United States controlling the South and the Russians controlling the North, no one truly knew what was to come.
Ever since World War II, when the peninsula was split between Russia and the United States, had the countries been fighting over what should be done with the divided parts of what was Korea. This led to tension, which led to war, and later, the fear of China joining with or against Russia put forward whether this war would become much larger and eventually turn into another world war. Throughout the Korean War, each country was being supplied troops from the United Nations. The United States supplied the most troops at 327,000, but 20 other countries had contributed to helping either one of the two countries of North and South Korea. Russia provided North Korea with weapons to help attack the South and bring Korea under all communist rule.
In the Korean War, the weather conditions were terrible. At temperatures 25 degrees below zero in the North Korean mountains, but still had much to affect the United Nations. As the war carried on, the harsh Korean winters immobilized and pinned down enemy fire. There were no replacements, and the wounded laid on the ground, hopeless, with no way to be helped. The harsh Korean War allowed way for 5,300 cases of frostbite for the U.S. Army and the Marines, which was devastating to the troops. There were 6.8 million American men and women who served during the Korean War, with more than 7,000 still missing in action. One of these men was the commander of the 24th Infantry Division, William F. Dean. After falling down a cliff and being knocked unconscious, two South Koreans found him and acted as if they were leading him to safety, but in actuality led them to a North Korean ambush site, where he was prisoner until the end of the war. The Korean War, in fact, was not an individual war, but it was a part of the Cold War. When the Korean War had started, the U.S. actually took control of South Korea, and during the war, the U.S. president fired one of the UN generals. He fired him because of many incorrect moves that were made by the general. The Korean War Memorial is located near the Lincoln Memorial on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. It was finished on July 27, 1995, and it commemorates all the sacrifices of the 5.8 million Americans who served time in the war. There are 19 soldiers in the memorial, each representing a branch in the military. This memorial represents all the sacrifice these soldiers gave during the war.
The Korean War cost the United States $30 billion in 1953, which is equivalent to about $276 billion in 2017. And the annual war expenditure comprised of about 14.1% of the GDP, and these costs are still being paid as of today. In comparison, World War I cost $334 billion. World War II cost $4.1 trillion. And the 21st century wars cost $1.5 to $1.7 trillion. Also, the draft in the Korean War inducted around 1.5 million people at the age of 18 and a half years and up. The problem was that more than 80,000 people were suspected of dodging the draft, But there was a survey in which 64% of people surveyed felt that the draft was fair. Rural life during the Korean War in the Americas was tolerable. First, it pulled young people off the farm, although at much lower levels than in World War II. It provided a substantial but not a long-lasting spike in the farm income as demand for food to feed the soldiers increased. The war also increased the government's commodity helpful payments to farmers and shrank the issue of overproduced farm products that had been stockpiled by the Commodity Credit Corporation in the late 40s. Succeeding the war, crop prices came under pressure by consumers demanding lower food costs. There were lots of weapons and equipment used during the Korean War. One of those pieces of equipment was the M24 Chaffee light tank, one of a very light tank the U.S. had, but was no match to the T-34 tanks used by the North Koreans. They also used the M1 Grand semi-automatic rifle, which used an 8-round clip and was the first semi-automatic rifle issued as the standard infantry rifle. Another weapon they used was a Thompson submachine gun, also known as the grease gun, and it originally came with a 50-round drum, but most military-issued Thompsons used either a 20 or 30-round stick magazine, which consisted of a gunner and an assistant loader team. And it became the standard for the Army in 1948, the 3.5-inch bazooka.
Hi, my name is Nuke, and I'm a Korean War veteran.
What were the living conditions like during the Korean War?
The conditions were very harsh to fight through, with 25-degree below zero weather conditions and rough terrain, so we didn't know where we were going or what we were going into.
So Nuke, what did your uniforms look like during the war?
During the war, we had to wear white or beigeish uniforms to match the terrain up in the mountains, because that's where we were fighting, and there's a white snow, so the beige uniforms helps us match into the snow so the enemies couldn't see us that well. And then we had fur coats, fur-coated hats from animals to keep our head warm, because when your head gets dizzy, you often tend to get dizzy and nauseous. And then we had nips as pants to help keep them up, because the snow, once it gets wet, it makes it soggy kind of, and it pulls it down. And then we didn't really feel that safe, because keep in mind, the suits were only half an inch thick, so probably one bullet could end your life. So it was very scary.
Hey Nuke, what did you eat while serving?
While we were serving, the kitchen often fed us spicy sausage stew, but we didn't really like that, if I'm being honest, so we just took the riskier route and we smuggled surplus food from the U.S. Army, which was half decent better. It wasn't great, but it helped us survive and gave us enough energy to fight through the thick snow and get to the enemy lines better.
So Nuke, how was the relationship between you and your fellow soldiers?
So me and my fellow soldiers honestly weren't allowed to talk too much because of strict rules of nonsense and nonsense behavior and speaking from our generals. They didn't allow us to talk because they'd be afraid if the enemies or any animals nearby could hear us. So we just stayed quiet and didn't talk most of the time if they weren't nearby. We often like to play card games and board games to pass time and help us not remember and get homesick, because most of us had wives and children, and many of you parents might know that you start to miss them even after one day, but we were out there for months.
What was your reaction on being drafted into the war?
So my initial reaction getting drafted into the war, I was actually with my family out in a dinner, and somehow they found me. I really don't know why. It was kind of creepy. So at first they told me, would you like to join the war? I honestly said no, but they said, can you come with us? So I went with them just to talk, but then they gave me one day to go back and pack my stuff, and so I did.
Oh, well, I'm the type of guy who will never settle down. Where pretty girls are, well, you know that I'm around. 'cause to me they're all the same. I hug them and I squeeze them, I don't even know their name. They call me the wanderer.